The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, swallowing the barren land of Montana in a shroud of white. Ice sealed the rot of the earth, and at the edge of a frost-bitten cattle yard, a young woman stood shackled to a wagon, like a mule bound for slaughter. Her name was June, 22 years old, her belly round with life, her lips cracked raw from the cold. A few feet away, her brother bartered with a rancher who smelled of whiskey and worn leather. In his hands, the promise of coin. In hers, nothing but the bite of rusted chains and the steady, insistent pulse of a child not yet born. "She's healthy," her brother said, his voice as dry as the winter air. "Strong legs, doesn't talk much. She's 7 months along, but the baby will come clean." The rancher's dead eyes appraised her, a slow, methodical inventory. "And she doesn't run." Her brother grinned, a cruel slash in his thin face. "She won't. Not anymore." It was then that it happened. A sudden, sharp kick from deep inside her womb. Not the gentle flutters she had grown used to, not the slow, rolling turn of a growing child. This was a jolt, powerful and urgent, like a fist demanding to be heard. June's breath caught in her throat. Another kick, then another. It wasn't pain. It was a command. She closed her eyes, the snow clinging to her lashes, and a silent promise formed in her soul. "I hear you, little one. I hear you, and I swear they will not sell you too." The wind burned her cheeks. The rancher was preparing to haul her away, the wagon creaking under his weight. Chains scraped as she was yanked toward the rear. Her brother didn't look back. The price of her life gleamed cold and triumphant in his hand. He waited for the wagon wheel to hit a stump, for the perfect jolt, the momentary shift in balance. And in that instant, June moved. She twisted hard, slamming her shoulder into the man beside her. The chain snagged, then cracked against a rail with a sharp retort. The rancher cursed. She rolled, feet hitting the snow, knees buckling as her body fell into white, into cold, into a desperate, terrifying freedom. The impact stole the air from her lungs. Pain lanced up her side. But before they could even shout, she was up, limping, bleeding, running. Behind her, men's voices rose in anger. Boots crunched in pursuit. But she did not stop. Branches slapped at her face. Ice sliced at her skin. The world dissolved into a blur of gray and red, a high-pitched ringing of fear in her ears. Her breath tore through her throat, and bright drops of blood dotted the snow behind her. Her boots were soaked, her coat a meager defense, her body fragile. But she ran, because inside her was someone else, and that someone was not for sale. She could feel it now, a heartbeat that was not her own, pounding in time with hers like a twin drum, a presence that pushed through her fear with a will of its own. It was a silent, urgent plea. "Run, Mama, run." And so she did. Through pines older than memory, past crows that watched without scattering, over ridges no human foot had touched that winter. Her lungs burned, her knees screamed, her arms clutched her belly like a shield. No one had ever protected her. Not her father, long since lost to a bottle. Not her mother, buried beneath the weight of her own sadness. And certainly not her brother, who had just traded her body for a weapon. But she could protect this child, even if it killed her. Twilight bled across the sky. The snow deepened, and the wind howled, low and long, like a lone wolf on the hunt. Her pace slowed, her vision blurring. She could no longer feel her fingers. Still, She pressed on until her foot slipped. She tumbled down a short ravine, landing in a drift so deep it swallowed half her body. The cold knocked her silent. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. Then another kick. Softer this time. Not urgent, not afraid, just present. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice cracking, her lips blue. "We're still here." She clawed forward, dragging herself through the snow as shadows crept between the circling trees. And then she saw it. A light. Small, faint but steady, flickering through the woods just above the ridge. A cabin. A fire. A chance. June didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just moved. One slow breath at a time. One silent prayer with every agonizing inch. Ahead lay either warmth or death. She would take either so long as it was not a cage. Pressing a hand to her stomach, she felt the baby quiet, still, trusting. "Hold on, little one," she whispered into the encroaching dark. "Mama's not done yet." Just after dusk, the wind shifted. Thomas froze mid-swing, axe buried halfway in a log of pine. He tilted his head, listening. Years alone in these woods had sharpened his senses beyond the need for speech. The sound was faint, ragged breathing, and something softer beneath it. He dropped the axe. Moving with the silence of a shadow, he slipped through the tree line, his boots making almost no sound on the snow. He followed the trail of broken branches and a whisper of blood, not animal. Then he saw her, crumbled in a drift like a broken sparrow, one hand curled protectively over her belly. Her lips were blue, her hair matted with ice. Blood had crusted along her temple. The child within her was obvious, 7, maybe 8 months along. She opened her eyes, barely able to focus, and her mouth formed a single soundless word. "Help." Thomas crouched, his brow furrowed not in confusion, but in calculation. The snow had already half covered her. Wolves or the cold would claim her before dawn. She would not make it on her own. He stood, scanning the trees. More tracks. Multiple sets of boots, heavier than hers. Men with weight. They would come looking. He moved fast. He swept pine branches over the blood trail, erasing it. He kicked snow over every footprint, looping the path to confuse any pursuit. From the brush, he unearthed a snare trap, quick, clean, and not meant for animals. If they followed, they would limp back. When he returned to her, she had stopped shivering, a bad sign. He sighed through his nose, a puff of white in the frigid air. Then, without a word, he bent and lifted her into his arms. She was light, far too light, but a faint, soft breath still ghosted from her lips. "Damn waste," he muttered to the uncaring trees. "Freezing to death with a baby. What kind of world leaves you out here?" He adjusted her weight against his chest and started for his cabin, a half-mile east, hidden in a thicket of evergreens. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. He only burned a fire when he had to. He hadn't expected to use it again this week. He kicked the door open with his boot, careful not to jostle her, and lowered her onto a cot beside the stove. The small room smelled of pine tar, old wool, and iron. Bare, but clean. Thomas stoked the embers, layered on fresh logs, and soon, warmth crawled across the floor like a waking beast. He removed her wet boots and wrapped a thick fur over her legs, tucking her frozen fingers beneath it with surprising care. Only then did he speak again, half to himself. Don't take in strays. Waste of good firewood. He sat across from her, watching as a flicker of color returned to her face, her breathing growing steadier. He stared at the fire, its orange and gold flames licking the iron belly of the stove. He remembered another fire, years ago, a different night. Screaming, smoke, and his daughter's small fingers slipping from his grasp in a burning doorway. He hadn't lit a fire for anyone since. Now he stoked it again, for a woman he did not know and a child he would never see. He filled a kettle with snow and set it on the stove to melt. Outside, the wind howled, ancient and unforgiving. But inside, the cabin pulsed with a dangerous, forgotten warmth. As the woman slept, Thomas's gaze lingered on her belly, not with curiosity, but with a grim sense of obligation. Whatever she was running from had no place here, and for the first time in years, he had lit a fire not just to survive, but to keep someone else alive. June woke to the crackle of a fire and the scent of pine smoke. The world was quiet, soft, and strangely safe. She sat up slowly, her head resting on a pillow stuffed with straw and old wool. The cabin was small, every item placed with function, not charm. Tin mugs on a shelf, a pot of stew steaming beside the stove, a single candle flickering on a small table. And there, in a corner near the hearth, as if placed by a ghost, stood a wooden cradle. Simple, old, hand-carved. One leg had been mended. It was angled to catch the fire's warmth, its interior lined with a folded quilt. Her breath caught. She looked down at her own swollen belly, and the baby kicked once. Softly. Present. "We're safe," she whispered. Thomas was gone, but his presence lingered in every rough-edged kindness. A smooth, sanded comb beside the candle, her boots drying by the fire. And next to the stew, a scrap of paper with a single line in rough, squared handwriting. "Don't burn the stew, belly's big as a grain barrel. Don't lift anything heavy." A small, unexpected smile touched her lips. When Thomas returned later, carrying firewood, he simply nodded. "You're up." I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "Don't do things to be thanked," he muttered, pulling off his gloves. "You needed heat." He sniffed the stew, added a pinch of salt. "Eat." When she reached for a bowl, he stopped her. "Blue one's lighter." June blinked. "You've thought of everything." He just grunted. As she sat at the small table, the warmth of the soup filling her like a prayer, her eyes fell on the mantel. A delicate, handmade frame. Inside, no photograph, just a name etched in a soft, looping script. Ellie. She looked up. Your daughter?" Thomas froze. His jaw tensed. "Yes." "She's not here?" "Was. Long time ago." He exhaled, a slow, painful breath. Fire took her. June's hands went still around the bowl. "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "Me too." She rose and walked to the cradle, running a hand along its smooth edge. "This was hers?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them, wide and deep. "I cry for mine too," June whispered. "And she's not even born yet." Thomas turned away. Not good at saving people. Never was. "You saved me." He shook his head. "No. I just hate seeing things freeze." He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, pausing before he left. But I can keep something warm, he said, his voice low. That I can still do. Then he was gone, back into the snow. And for the first time in a long, long time, June didn't feel like she was waiting to be discarded. She felt, somehow, safe. The days folded into a quiet rhythm. June learned the cabin's language, the creak of a floorboard, the logs that burned longest. The silence no longer frightened her. It wrapped around her like an old wool coat. Thomas moved through his days half-tethered to the world, noticing everything but saying little. Every kindness came wrapped in bark. Door won't slam now, he'd grunt after fixing a hinge. Don't thank me. I hate debt. One night, as the wind scraped against the cabin walls, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats, faint at first, but drawing closer. June's eyes shot to the window. Thomas was already beside her. No words, no questions. He pulled her to her feet and pressed a panel in the back wall, revealing a crawl space. In there, he said, his voice sharp. Stay low. She obeyed, heart pounding, and he shut the panel wust as the hoofbeats stopped. The cabin door creaked open. Looking for a girl, a gruff voice said. Pregnant, ran this way. Thomas's reply was low and even. You see a woman out here. She's not pregnant long. A pause. We're paid to bring her back. You live alone? Now I remember why. Boots scraped the floor. June held her breath. Mind if we look around? I do. She ain't here, Thomas stated, his voice flat as stone. And if she was, I'd say the same. Now leave before the wolves start wondering what you smell like. More silence. Then, retreating steps. The door closed. 10 minutes later, the panel opened. Thomas stood there, axe still in his hand, his jaw tight. They're gone, he said. For now. June crawled out, shaky. They'll be back. Yes. What will we do? He met her gaze, a bridge forming across their two broken lives. We leave. Before the next snow. I know someone. He began gathering supplies. A knife, rope, dried meat. An old woman near the river pass. She won't lie to me. Why? June asked softly. Why are you doing this? Thomas paused, his rough hands still for a moment. Because, he said, his voice gruff as ever, I don't leave fires to go out on their own. He handed her a scarf. Wrap up. We ride at dawn. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was no longer safe, but June understood. The fire he had lit that first night hadn't burned down. It had just begun to move. Before the sun breached the horizon, they were ready. The only sounds were the soft thud of supplies into canvas and the creak of wood under Thomas's boots. June clutched her belly as a fresh wave of pressure rolled through her. I can't move fast, she whispered. He glanced at her, jaw clenched. Then I'll move for you. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms, wrapped her in furs, and carried her to the waiting wagon. He placed her gently on a bed of straw in the back, pulling the cover down, as if shielding something fragile the world had no right to touch. The wagon rolled out through the trees, its wheels muffled by the snow. They moved in silence, two souls and a third not yet born, fleeing into the vast, unforgiving white. June lay with a hand on her belly, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The child within her kicked, a sharp, insistent pulse, as if it too knew something dangerous trailed them on the wind. Through a slit in the wagon's canvas, she saw the world as a frozen blur. Skeletal pines, branches glazed in ice, and the rigid line of Thomas's back as he drove them deeper into the unknown. At one point, the silence became too heavy to bear. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice a fragile crack in the cold air. "To someone who doesn't ask questions," he said, his words clipped by the wind. "Someone who saved me once when I couldn't save anyone." The daylight bled away behind a shroud of gray cloud. They stopped only once for water. Thomas brought her a canteen, his movements spare and efficient. He helped her sit up, saying nothing as she trembled, simply pulling the rough wool blanket tighter around her shoulders before moving on. As night fell, the dense forest began to thin, and in the distance, a stone chimney rose from behind a low hill, breathing a lazy curl of smoke into the twilight. Tucked beside a frozen river, surrounded by a thicket of brush and sleeping willows, sat a small cottage. An old woman was already standing on the porch before they'd even reached the gate, as if she had been listening to their approach on the currents of the air itself. She was small, but her spine was unbent by age, and her eyes were as sharp and unforgiving as broken flint. "You brought the storm with you," she said to Thomas, her voice like stones grinding together. He gave a single, sharp nod. "And the fire I need to keep lit." Her gaze shifted to June, flicking over the swell of her belly, the pallor of her cheeks. "You didn't make her this way." It was not a question. "No. But she is yours to guard now." Thomas said nothing. The woman stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the house was warmer than it looked, filled with the scent of dried herbs hanging from the beams and a rich stew simmering over the hearth. The woman guided June to a cot by the fire, her hands careful but firm. "She's close," she announced, looking from June to Thomas. "The child wants to come soon." Thomas stood near the door, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "They'll find us, won't they?" June whispered, the fear a knot in her throat. "They'll try," the woman replied, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "But this is my land. I see the footprints of guilt long before the guilty arrive." She handed Thomas a cloth. "Boil more water, and sharpen your axe." That night, they came. 3 of them, their voices loud and coarse, their faces etched with a casual cruelty. They carried rifles as if they were extensions of their own limbs. The old woman stepped outside before their knuckles could touch her door. "We're looking for a girl," the leader said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Young, pregnant." The old woman tilted her head. "Funny," she said, her voice deceptively mild. "All I see tonight are wolves and wind." The man frowned, his patience thinning. "We were told she came this way." "I see no one," she said again. "But I do see a man with a hunger in his eyes, the kind that leaves stains on the land and on the soul." The second man stepped forward, trying for a placating tone. "We don't mean any trouble, ma'am." "No," she snapped, her voice now a whip. "But you carry it with you all the same." A heavy silence stretched, thick and cold. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the trees. Thomas. He stood just beyond the reach of the lantern light, the axe held loosely in one hand. He did not speak. He did not have to. The way he stood, shoulders squared against the world, the way his eyes burned, not with rage but with a cold, absolute warning, made the men falter. It was the stillness of a predator that knows it does not need to chase. Maybe she went the other way, one of them muttered, his bravado gone. The old woman almost smiled. They turned, their boots crunching on the snow, their curses swallowed by the wind. Inside from the shadows, June had watched it all. She turned back to the fire, her heart thudding, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Later, as she lay by the hearth, she whispered to the child safe inside her. "He stood like a mountain," she said, her hand resting on her stomach, "and they scattered like dust." Outside, beneath a sliver of moon, Thomas kept watch, silent and unmovable as the stones of the earth. The wind howled like a grieving woman, its icy fingers probing the cracks of the old house, rattling the shutters like a ghost's knuckles. But inside the fire roared, casting a wild golden light across the thick beams and ancient shelves, a light that danced on jars of herbs and dust and untold stories. June was on the bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on her brow, mingling with tears she didn't remember crying, her hands gripping the woolen blanket as if it were the only rope keeping her from sinking into a vast, dark ocean. Thomas stood nearby, his own face pale and stiff. His knuckles were white where he clutched the edge of a basin. "I don't know how to," he began, his voice strained. The old woman cut him off with a look. "You know how to keep a tree from falling in a storm. You know how to keep a fire alive in a broken hearth. You know how to keep wolves from what is worth protecting." She placed a firm hand on his chest. "Tonight, you will keep her." He nodded, mute, and knelt beside June. "I'm here," he said, the words rough but solid. "That's all I know how to be." June gritted her teeth as another waft of pain crested. "It's enough." The old woman worked with a quiet, certain grace, her hands never trembling. She murmured in a language neither of them knew, laying out cloths and herbs, her movements a ritual as old as the hills. The wind screamed, slapping at the windows, and June's body buckled. A long, guttural cry tore from a place deep inside her, a sound ancient and raw. Thomas caught her hand. The contact seemed to surprise them both. "You're not alone," he said. Her eyes locked with his. In their depths she saw no fear. She saw a stillness, the kind found in trees that have weathered 100 years of storms. "Breathe with me," he whispered. And she did. Another contraction, another tidal wave of pain. Her fingers dug into his shirt, pulling, anchoring herself to him. He did not flinch. He held the basin. He lit another candle. He pressed a cool cloth to her burning forehead. "Tell me what hurts," he said. "Everything," she gasped. "Then give it to me," he said. And she sobbed, not from pain, but from a staggering, impossible trust. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and the fire flared in answer. The room felt both impossibly small and as vast as the sky. The old woman leaned forward. "Now, child, push!" June screamed. Thomas held fast. Another push, the world dissolving into white-hot agony. And then, a sound. Not the wind, not the fire. A cry, sharp, piercing, and fiercely alive. The child was born into the heart of the storm, between two people who had never asked for anything, but were given everything in that one, screaming instant. The old woman lifted the baby, cleaned her, wrapped her in soft cloth, and laid her on June's chest. "She's strong," the woman said, "like her mother." June stared at the tiny, slick face, the blinking eyes, the miniature fists balled in defiance. The baby wailed again, and June laughed, a sound soft and cracked, but real. She's perfect." Thomas stood frozen, a man carved from wood. "She's yours too," June said, her voice weak but clear. He shook his head. "No." But she reached out, took his calloused hand, and pressed it against the baby's tiny, warm body. "She was born because you kept the fire burning, because you stayed. You held the storm back just long enough for her to arrive." His breath hitched. The baby stilled, her crying softening as she felt his touch. "You kept the fire for me," June whispered. "Now I'll keep her. For us." For a long time, Thomas said nothing. He just stood there with the storm wailing outside, a new life breathing beneath his fingers, and a feeling rising in his chest that hurt more than any wound had ever hurt before. He almost smiled. By dawn, the cradle was finished. Thomas had carved it from a single piece of pine, sanding it smooth and etching wildflowers along its curves, the kind that bloomed near riverbeds in the spring. It was sturdy, made to last through winters and through time. He placed it by the fire and stepped back, rubbing the ache from his shoulder. June entered, the baby nestled against her chest. She stopped when she saw it. "You made this?" He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. The old one squeaked. June ran a hand over the carved flowers, her eyes misting. "These. I used to pick them with my mother. Before. She'd want the child to see them again," he said, his voice quiet. That night, June hummed lullabies she hadn't sung since she was a girl, the melodies soft and strange in the silent cabin. Thomas sat nearby, sharpening a blade, his eyes half closed. He never joined in, but he never left. He was a constant presence, silent and steady, never farther than a breath away. One afternoon, the quiet was broken. Footsteps, a wagon. Thomas was outside in an instant, axe in hand. June faded back into the shadows of the cabin, her heart a cold stone in her chest. 3 men dismounted. The one in front held a piece of paper. "We're looking for a runaway," he announced. "Woman gave birth recently. Her brothers have posted a reward." Thomas said nothing. The man stepped closer, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Word is, a woman matching her description is living out here." He gestured with the paper. "She's a criminal." "She's a mother," Thomas said, his voice flat and hard. The man smirked. "So you are hiding her?" Thomas's eyes turned to steel. He shifted his weight, and something in his stance changed. It was more than defiance. It was something darker, heavier, the kind of absolute threat that comes not from words, but from a man who has nothing left to lose but the one small light he has sworn to protect. "You want her," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You'll have to take me first." The man hesitated. The second rider touched his arm. "It's not worth it. Look at him." Thomas didn't move a muscle. The men mounted their horses, casting one last uneasy glance over their shoulders, and rode away. When the sound of their departure had faded completely, June stepped out of the shadows, clutching her daughter tight. She looked at Thomas, really looked at him. at the weary lines etched into his face, the worn coat, the calloused hands still wrapped around the axe handle, and his eyes, not cruel, not soft, but burning with a fierce loyalty she had never known. She walked toward him slowly. "You didn't have to do that." He looked away, toward the trees. They weren't worth the trouble. A gentle smile touched her lips. "But you are." He said nothing. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him. "You're not just a roof over my head," she whispered. "You're a hearth, a shelter." She touched his arm, and he finally met her gaze. "You're home," she said softly, "even without a roof." Spring melted the last of the snow. The cabin stood taller now, reinforced, its roof patched with fresh timber. A second window let in the morning light, and beside it, a new shelf held the herbs June had begun to gather and dry. Thomas still rose before dawn, but now his axe often rested between the small wooden animals he was carving for his daughter: a bear, a horse, a bird. The girl, now months old, had his quiet, watchful gaze. She would lie by the fire, making small, determined sounds, as if she already had stories to tell. The nearby village, once just a name spoken with caution, began to extend a hand, an invitation to a spring festival. At first Thomas resisted. "We're not people for gatherings." June had smiled, rocking their daughter. "No, but she might be." So they went. The ceremony was simple: a great bonfire circled by stones, surrounded by faces weathered by sun and time. June was invited to speak. Thomas stood beside her, stiff in a clean shirt, the baby sleeping soundly against his chest in a sling. June stepped forward, feeling the solid earth beneath her feet. She faced the flames. "My name is June," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Once I was sold by my own blood. I was silenced. I ran, not because I was brave, but because the child inside me was fighting for a life she hadn't yet seen." She glanced at Thomas, then back at the fire. "I wasn't saved by a hero. I wasn't rescued with promises or poetry." Her voice grew stronger. "I was found by a man who said little, a man who built fires when the world was cold, who left food on the table without a word, who sharpened knives so I could feed myself, who stood between me and the darkness." She touched her heart. "He gave me no speeches about safety. He simply made it true. He gave me shelter. He gave me warmth. He gave me a cradle, carved from his own loss." A hush fell over the gathering. She stepped back, and in the silence, Thomas moved. He approached her, and from his pocket, he drew a small, smooth piece of wood he'd been carving. It was a simple knife, a child's toy, and on its blade was a single word: hope. He knelt and gently placed it in their daughter's tiny, sleeping hand. "She'll outgrow it," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. "But she'll remember it was sharp once." The baby stirred, her fingers closing around the carved word. Later that night, they returned to the cabin. The fire burned low and warm. June rocked their daughter, humming softly. Thomas sat nearby, carving a new piece of wood, his brow furrowed in concentration. Not because the work was hard, but because he knew one day she would hold it. And that was enough to make it sacred. Outside, snow began to fall. the flakes drifting down in a quiet, unhurried descent. But this snow carried no memory of a chase, no chill of fear. It carried only a profound and peaceful silence. And that, at long last, was peace. If this story touched something quiet in your heart, if you felt the snow, the fire, and the weight of a silence broken by love, then you understand what we do here. At Wild West Love Stories, we keep the flame of forgotten tenderness alive. These aren't just tales of the frontier, they're stories of the heart's wilderness. They are about people who choose love in the loneliest of places, and about souls who find family where they least expect it. If you want more stories of broken people finding their way home, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss it when we light the fire again. Until next time, may your roads be rough enough to remember, and your fires warm enough to stay.